Welcome to the Meru Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media Podcast. I'm your host today, Mukunda. I am joined by a scholar that I've been following for quite a few years, especially on his YouTube. He's got so many videos. One of the most impressive ones I enjoyed was him talking about Hindu Dharma and bioethics. I thought that was amazingly interesting, which I don't think many Hindu scholars have done. So that to me really pulled me in. And it is Dr. Deepak Sarma, who of Case Western University in Ohio. So Dr. Sarma, namaskaram, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So Dr. Sarma is an expert on Hindu philosophy. Primarily, he's been writing for many years on Dvaita. All his interests have also moved on a little bit from that. I thought I would love to have him on the podcast because while we've explored Vishishta Dvaita and Nimbarka and Advaita and even recently Shaiva Siddhanta and Trika, we haven't really explored Madhva Vedanta philosophy because it's a very unique philosophy, but we'll get into that later. But Dr. Sarma, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. So tell us about yourself. Like, what made you, what was your journey into studying, Sanskrit, studying the philosophy? Because like me, I think you're like an ABCD, quote unquote, right? Born, raised, and kind of lived in America. It's unique for us to really step into this field and try to learn about this. So if you can, that'd be great.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I was just writing about this today. And as a senior faculty with tenure, I have nothing to lose anymore. So I can tell the whole story, so to speak. So in brief, though it won't be that brief, but in brief, of course, I was urged to be a STEM student in high school, right? And sometime during high school, I became a little suspicious of STEM, largely because I was just being pushed to become a doctor and engineer.
Right.
And sometime in this time period, I got exposed to kind of new alternative creative ways of thinking originating from late 60s, early 70s San Francisco, shall we say.
Sure.
And here. And this led me to really want to explore new ways of thinking and become very skeptical of what I would call a Hobbesian sort of approach, right?
Sure.
STEM is kind of a Hobbesian approach. Like that you have to get a job, make money, and compete with thousands of people in the process and win. Right? So very briefly, I had gotten admitted to an engineering math program at NYU in Cooper Union. And at NYU in Cooper Union, I went there and was very suspicious of having to go down this route, but did it nonetheless, or thought I would do it nonetheless. The first week I was there, the Grateful Dead played 9 shows at Madison Square Garden, and I went to all of them, right? I think there's a poster right there of that.
Yeah, you also wrote an article about this picture of Narasimha on Grateful Dead too.
I did. Right. And and then I became much more skeptical of what reality is and whether or not this kind of Hobbesian approach was worth pursuing. I distinctly remember students at NYU pulling the alarm the night before the OChem exam and things like that, or the chemistry exam, so that we would have trouble studying. So it was so competitive.
Wow.
So I became very skeptical of this process and really wondering, the most existential question you could wonder is why am I here at all?
Right.
I was very fortunate that my dad, who was a faculty member at SUNY Stony Brook teaching biochemistry, took sabbatical at Genentech out in California,
right,
in San Francisco, Burlingame. Maybe you've come across this story. And they made a deal with me that I would come out and stay with them in Burlingame, and I made a deal that I would come if and only if they sent me to summer school at Berkeley. And so I hung out with them for a little bit, went over to Berkeley. I was supposed to be enrolled in C++ and linear algebra or something like that.
Right.
And I took it, and after 2 weeks, I was like, this is simply not for me. Right. Simply not for me. And along the lines of thinking about Hobbes, is that Berkeley is an interesting non-Hobbesian place sometimes. So you have people wandering around Berkeley who are thinking about idealism and about social justice and so on. Right. And of course, not to mention people who are wondering about whether or not reality really is what you think it is.
Right. Especially with the psychedelics there.
Yes, indeed, right? So I convinced my parents in a very, there was a lot of weeping outside of Davidson Hall, if anybody knows Berkeley, about like, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I can't be an engineer, mathematician anymore. And I thought I would go into the humanities. And my dad at that time made me promise, if you go into the humanities, you should get a master's or a PhD because it'll be pointless otherwise.
Right.
I agreed, not knowing what it meant, but I did it. Okay. And now here's where the story gets really unique, I think, is that the Grateful Dead were playing, for those of you who don't know, we're playing shows in Tacoma and in Eugene. And I was hanging out with a friend of mine, and we went up to the shows. And one of the nights we crashed in Portland at a friend of his was going to college there and had an apartment or something. And we went to go check out the college. They were hippies everywhere. It was a beautiful, beautiful school, tie-dyes everywhere you looked. That was Reed College in Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked around and I saw this and I said, this is where I should be, not NYU. So I went back to NYU and got out of that particular major. And I took a class, I think, in like Marxism, history of death, and Hinduism for that matter, right?
Yeah.
And I was intrigued when I was in California, by the way, that I saw all of these deadheads and all these hippies intrigued themselves and curious about Hinduism. And as an ABCD, it's so hard to embrace the culture that you are coming from, so to speak, that it was really kind of odd to see this. And I thought, well, maybe there's something to Hinduism. My parents never raised me very religiously. I didn't know that I was a Madhva at that time. Okay. I most certainly didn't. So I transferred to Reed College.
Okay.
Okay. And I transferred to Reed College and I took a class, I repeated a class in Hinduism. And it was with a professor who's still alive named Edwin Giroux, who used to teach Sanskrit at Chicago. He was the Sanskrit chair at Chicago. And after some interesting, I was the only Indian that he taught, certainly at Reed College. There were only so few Indians at Reed College that people knew me by first name and so on.
Sure.
I mean, it's a small school anyway. But so when I was with him and studying with him, he began asking me questions about who I was and where I'm from. So my name is Deepak Sarma, right?
Right.
And so he assumed I was North Indian from UP. And I said, no, I'm from South India. And so in those days, there's one phone in the hallway in the dorm when you talk to your parents once a week, and I would have this back and forth with my parents, right? You can imagine this. And Giroux was able to uncover finally that I was a Madhva from Udupi. So I was born, and he was more interestingly, and I wrote about this for a fest trip for him, even more interestingly in the Journal of Hindu Studies, I think it was. More interestingly, he reveals to me that he had himself studied Madhva Vedanta in Udupi. And it turns out, even more interestingly, that the person who connected him there and put him up in a guest house was my dad's social studies teacher.
Wow. That's very interesting.
And that Giroux was studying Sanskrit with who is now passed, Sri Bananjay Govindacharya, who turned out to be living 3 houses, like 2 blocks from my uncle's house and is kind of vaguely a relative.
Yeah, everyone in my family, many of my uncles love listening to Bananjay.
Yeah, he was a great scholar. Somewhere here I have a Bananjay's Reflections. Yeah, there was a fest trip, and I got to write in it, and Giroux wrote in it, and Goldman wrote in it. So it was really, it was a pretty cool thing to be able to write in. So anyway, he was like, wow. And he knew that it was really the strangest sort of thing. Right? I mean, how do you explain this, right? Very strange. And at this time, of course, Reed College being Reed College, that my questions about reality and not reality, so to speak, whether or not things were mind only, were prominent, shall we say. So I made this clear to Giroux, and Giroux advised me in the way that he does that I would be able to examine the philosophical issue and learn something about my forefathers if I looked at the debate between Advaita and Dvaita Vedanta on whether or not things are real. Right? So it was a really fabulous kind of
introduction. Yeah,
absolutely fabulous. So I could address my existential questions and my traditional kind of questions. And at the same time, in a peculiar way, I had imagined, though it didn't turn out to be as true as I thought, get some peculiar kind of validation from the Indian community because it seemed somehow pakka in some way. But there was really no validation after a few. They thought, how come he's not a doctor?
Right.
But that's aside. Okay. So that's really how that began. And then I did that work. I spent one of the summers before my senior year at Reed College is a big senior thesis that you spend a year writing, and I went to Udupi and I studied with Bananjay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was super cool, and I was amazed that he even, now I realize just how lucky I was to even hang out with him and how much patience he had for me, because I was so new to everything, right? I mean, I didn't know Sanskrit. It was wonderful. So, and then I came back to Reed College and I wrote my BA thesis on this topic. And because Reed College being Reed College, I got bit by the Reed College academic bug. And there was no question that I need to continue and to pursue my study of Dvaita Vedanta at where I got admission, which was the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, to pursue a continuation of my study of Madhva Vedanta with Paul Griffiths, who was there at that time, Wendy Doniger, who was there at that time. Oh my God, none of them are there anymore. And Shelley Pollack, who was there at that time.
Now he's at Columbia, I think, right?
He's at Columbia. So so he wasn't very supportive. So I went there and studied these people, ended up doing a little bit of Madhyamika Buddhism with Griffiths, which is what had such a heavy influence on me later in my life,
Sure.
And perhaps even at that time. To be really frank, right, is that after studying Madhyamika and skepticism, I was really torn about like how to study anything at all, and whether or not
I did too.
whether or not graduate school was even a good idea. And I was really torn about it. I was really not sure if I wanted to be in grad school, right?
Yeah.
I'm still not sure if
well, that ship has sailed.
it sailed, right? So and then by way of interesting story, right? Two things happened. Is that one of them is that Paul Griffiths, who was at that time, do you know his work, Paul Griffiths? At that time, he was Anglican, and he converted to Catholicism, right? And I remember Paul still is one of the brightest, most intelligent people I met, though his politics are very complicated, and I'm not speaking to that.
Sure.
And I asked him, and this was when the kind of Catholic issues about priests and so on and sexual abuse were coming. Right. So I remember asking Paul, "You're so smart. You've taught me Madhyamika Buddhism, which is like this pure skepticism. How are you possibly believing any of this stuff?" Right. And like, why would you be? He was converting to Catholicism. I was like, why the hell would you do this?
Right.
And Paul, being Paul, said that it was far easier to deconstruct things using Nagarjuna than it was to defend a flawed position.
Correct.
So he said, defend, see what you can do. Right. And then, I would say then soon afterwards, and I almost want a drum roll, Mukunda, is that I went, this now really, I don't know if you know this story, but you get to, if you're sitting down, it'll be a good thing, is that I went to Oregon after taking my PhD exams, and I was rock climbing without a helmet, and I slipped, fell, and broke my skull and had brain damage.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's pretty far out, right? So I had brain damage and, was in an ICU, helicopter, amnesia, who am I, aphasia, I can't speak, all this crazy stuff, right? And I had just finished my PhD exams, right? So this is really nutty. And my parents, I needed to have 24-hour supervision. So they happened to be in India at ISC for this. My dad was on sabbatical again. He had to fly back, and they had to collect me from Portland, Oregon, and take me back, or from Bend, Oregon. I was at Smith Rock, and take me back to their house in Stony Brook and take care of me for 6 months. When I was trying to figure out who I am. I don't know if this is appropriate, but there's a really cool podcast called Depth of the Personality that I did for the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Cleveland. So if you look up SoundCloud, my name, Depth of the Personality, it's just about that issue.
Oh, I'll definitely check it out then.
Yeah, and they used that podcast in their exhibit about death. I mean, it was really far out. So people could go in and listen to it. It was pretty neat. Because, it's an interesting kind of death of the personality.
Sure.
Death of the self, At any rate, so then I lived with my parents. And as I said in the podcast, in a very peculiar way, they got to reconfigure me. Think about like they got to reboot and reinstall software. Right. And then I went way too early. 6 months after my head injury, I was in India studying with Pandurangi in Bangalore. Right.
Yeah.
And I was kind of half out of it half the time. And eventually I started studying at the Vidyapitam, Purna Pragna Vidyapitam, and studied with Prahaladachar, who's now become a Swamiji, right? And to a degree, I think that I took Paul Griffith's suggestion into consideration, and I began learning this to defend it. And there's a lot of stuff to defend. And B, I think the hip word of today is neuroplasticity, right? I had a ton of neuroplasticity, and I was immersed in these worlds of orthodoxy, right? And then the third thing, and I want to say this about all of these traditions, is that once you start learning them and you start defending them and they become a right cognitive habit, is the expression I use, then it's very hard to figure out whether you buy into it or you believe it. Right. And I've written about that too, is that like once you can defend a tradition that well, you make it into a right cognitive habit, then is it something you believe and choose to believe, or is it something that you believe as true? Right. So it's a very complicated thing. So that's really how I ended up studying and writing about this tradition. It's a long story, but I think
no, I think it's absolutely cool. Because it's in some ways it mirrors some of my stuff. So in my 20s,
I mean, how old are you?
I'm 44 this year.
Oh, you're just a kid.
I mean, you're not that much older than me.
I'm 53. I'll be 54 in a couple of months. Go on.
So we're like similar generations, but in this sense, like, so in my 20s, I did something similar insofar as, so my background is a little different. I grew up in the U.S., in California, but my family was really, really involved in the religious world. Like, so I grew up with, I don't know if you know SMS Chari, SM Srinivasa Chari. Yeah. So I grew up with him, who's close friend of my dad. So I learned Vishishtadvaita through him for many years. Nice. And then I had this period of many years where I was kind of like agnostic, atheist, whatever. That was pushed by Nagarjuna too, by the way. So like in my, I remember when I was 19 or 20, where I was this really, I would say, basic theist, meaning so far as like I believed because I was told to believe, right? Growing up that way. So I had the Puttige Mata head at that time, Sugindra Tirtha. He had left India to do this, traveling circuit in US. He stayed with us for 2 weeks at our house.
Wow, all right.
And so we had Udupi, Udupi Krishna little murti that we would every day, every morning, 3 times a day. He had such mighty and acharam. It was really, really intense. He brought his own cooks. The cooks took over the kitchen. No one was allowed in. It was very interesting. So at that time, he actually told my father that he wanted me to come back with him to Udupi and train with him to be like a monk there too. Nice. But I was like, no, I don't think that's for me.
It's not gonna work. See ya. Right.
I was like, no. And then when I went to college, I spent a year studying in Delhi, where I got introduced to Buddhism, and I was studying Sanskrit, and I read the Madhyamika Karika of Nagarjuna. And honestly, that for the next 2.5 years of my life, I could not believe anything. I just was like, his prasanga, right? His Chatishkoti like destroys any sense of like
it does,
but then the flip side is, and then when you start thinking more about it, you're like, well, these are also the people that believe in multiple devas and multiple lokas, and they have this theological tradition on top of their philosophical tradition. Like, like Nagarjuna believes in these things. He wrote mantras towards bodhisattvas and so on. So I was like somehow he's reconciling this. So I was thinking in my head, so I mean, you go through the process and then you eventually learn. Like, I started defending more, I guess, Vaishnavism on the whole, and then particularly Vishishtadvaita over time. When I started reading more about it, and then read more like Whitehead and then Western philosophers, whether it's going to be like your Spinozas or your there's a lot of like threads that are similar across a lot of these different traditions. Nice. So then I was able to like piece together my own philosophical understanding of both the internal tradition of Vishishtadvaita along with its, I guess, universal aspect. Because I'm not parochial in the sense I don't buy into every little aspect of the tradition.
Right. You're a new age Vishishtadvaita.
Kind of, in some sense, because for me, it's like, if you are going to have a God that's universal in any regard, they have to be able to explain things about the world without explaining away.
Right.
And that was kind of like my project. So I guess it's a little similar in that sense that you learn by defense, you learn the tradition, and then the idea of, are you actually buying into this, or are you just believing it because you're believing it? But I also have got to the position I don't believe in free will, so that's also
is that right? Then you must like Dvaita Vedanta then.
Yeah, it's in some sense, yeah. Dvaita Vedanta is interesting to me. I find it very fascinating.
Have you
talked to
Fred? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's good. No, you go ahead.
I was going to ask if you talked to Fred Smith then yet.
I haven't. I have not.
He's written a little about free agency and things like that.
Oh, I should reach out
to
to him.
Rather free will, not free agency.
Yeah.
He's cool. You could tell him I said hi. But agency is an interesting thing, whether or not you have agency. Of course, for Madhva, you find like it's the most extreme version. You don't have any agency at all. Everything is predetermined. I mean, but that's itself kind of messy. Like, is there ever so slightly some agency or not? But once you buy into predestination, then why buy into agency at all?
Well, I don't buy into predestination. So I think that term is something I'm not aligned with. I'm with causal effect, just the chain of cause and effect. Like, it just, it's not predetermined. It's the probabilistic nature of the world is going to lead to this position more often than not. So yeah.
Probability, huh? Probability and certainty. I worry about probability when I teach the Charvaka and think about Vyapti, right? Because certainty is really about the claim for certainty is really about taking probability and making it reified and saying this is fact. So it's likely that the chair is beneath me when I sit, but it doesn't mean that it has to be, according to the Charvaka argument. Right. So I always tell my students here at CASE, who are mostly STEM, that they are confusing probability with certainty.
Right. Which is I think the scientific project, right? On the whole.
Yes, it really is.
It is we assumed, and this is Hume's argument also, right? His argument against inference is, this constant, we're looking for certainty when really what we're talking about is probability at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think that this is, of course, I think that a good scientist recognizes this. A vocational scientist has to ignore it.
Right. And this is also where I find like we have to be very, very conscious, even within the philosophical conversations around. Yeah, I at some level, I do think the traditions themselves are discussing these things, but they're like Mahabharata is really I think a narrative around this idea. People want certainty, and the text doesn't give it to you. The text gives you very little certainty. It just gives you probabilistic natures of things.
Oh, how interesting. That's an interesting interpretation. But of course, if you think that the Mahabharata is Shruti, then there's no probability. Then it's giving you some truth that you have to uncover, in the same way that the Vedas can't be vague, that it's only our own weakness not to be able to understand it properly. So you look at the commentary and so on. So, I mean, it's an interesting position to relegate the Mahabharata to Smriti in a way, rather than Shruti.
I mean, Mahabharata sits on the cusp, right? It is the Panchama Veda, but it's also a Smriti text, Itihasa. So it sits in these multiple categories. But like, I think even within the Vedic text or the Vedas, right? Like that idea, which I really enjoyed in most Indian philosophy, is that each pramana has its paramount, is paramount nature within a sphere, right? Like, for example, Vedas don't have power about the real world, about our senses. If our senses conflict with the Vedas lose out, except for when you talk about the nature of Brahman or Dharma, right?
Okay, fair enough.
Right. So, like,
you go ahead. Yeah.
No, but I mean, that's an interesting thing to see what Madhva has to say about the nature of the pramanas and vis-a-vis their areas of power.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to say that I'll have to look and see what I wrote, because I don't remember. So I don't know if that's a useful thing for me to pick up my book and tell you what I wrote. But if you want me to do that, I'll do that.
No, you don't have to do that.
I couldn't generate that now. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
All right. It's funny when the Madhva scholar ceases to know what he wrote in his book.
Well, he probably wrote so much. Sometimes people shift on their views on these things, right?
Right. So, well, in addition to shifting, like I said, like I have not worked on Madhva materials in a long time now.
Yeah.
Right. And like I said, like kind of the internal debates here at the AAR, American Academy of Religion, there was a long time when it was Vedanta, and then it just got replaced by Buddhism, and that was the end of that. And then so now, I mean, maybe there are people doing Vedanta now, but and then there was a really sad time. It must have been, oh gosh, it was a long time ago when scholars were questioning Madhvacharya's sources, which is, of course, you're welcome to do that. But then in certain contexts at the AAR, Dvaita Vedanta became a laughing stock. And so people would give papers and make fun of it. And it was a very strange thing. And I can remember when that happened. And maybe that was when I started not doing so much Madhva stuff, because people were, it was the very strange kind of Western kind of laughing at Madhva. It was a very strange thing. I mean, it was very peculiar when people would do that.
Right. No one will do that for someone like Martin Luther. You have to hold him to. There is this, like, I discussed this on the podcast I most recently released with Chakravarti Ramprasad about the nature, about academia and its engagement with Indian thought and Indian philosophy, and how much it's so utterly thoroughly colonized, and it's as if exactly, as if the only people that you can look at Plato, you can see, or Aristotle sees a misogynist, see this, but you can put all that away and just focus on the philosophy. But if you start doing that with like Mahabharata or Shankara or this or that or anybody, you're suddenly like left with their castists, their Brahmanists, their sexists, there's this, and there's no real engagement.
Right. It's just, it's a really complicated issue about how do you approach these, who becomes an expert, appropriation and exploitation, and then like importing or employing Western tools to study something, and really the utility of applying kind of contemporary Western or contemporary methods and theories to something that's 3,000 years old. Like, it's just like, it's funny when I teach. When I teach my like, let's say Madhva Dharma Shastra, and I have students who want to apply a feminist analysis to it, I think it's perfectly reasonable to do, right? But it's also kind of, it doesn't generate any new knowledge. Like, this is a patriarchal sexist text. But so in a way, it doesn't do that much, right? That's not to defend it or justify the patriarchy or the sexism there, but it becomes a useful exercise only for the student's own understanding. It doesn't produce any new knowledge, right?
Right. I think anyone can use any lens to view any text you want. But the question is, what are you trying to understand from that text? Are you trying to understand the text as the text is? Or are you trying to understand it from, let me put my cultural mores on the text and come out with...
Which naturally leads to Wendy Doniger. And I've written about this a few years ago about Wendy when she came out with when yet another one of her books got banned in India, right?
The Hindus, right? I have that.
Oh, yeah. And I think I wrote something about how the kind of creation of knowledge in the West, when it utilizes Indian sources and then resells them back to India, reminded me a lot of British colonization and cotton, right? And I wrote that. And when I think about like these very skilled applications of methods and theories to these texts, that really it's generating cultural capital in the Western context for people who are playing that particular language game, right?
Yeah.
And there's no doubt in my mind that somebody like Wendy Doniger is extremely adept and skilled at applying a, let's say, Freudian, but it has really nothing to do with India. And it has not, and it's really just a language game that's played by Western scholars, and she has tremendous cultural capital. I will grant her that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and then you have claims about voice and authority, and that this is how Indians should see the text, and it becomes really messy, right? So there's nothing off limits. Like, you can apply whatever method and theory to any text you want, but what is the value of it? What is the point of doing it? Where will you gain cultural capital? And so on. It's a good set of questions, and like I said, like you can use a hammer to do something that's really delicate that you don't need a hammer for.
No, absolutely. So I mean, like I've read a lot of Doniger's work, and some of it I find there's insights, but there's other things where I'm just like, I don't think this lens makes sense. And the analysis is honestly like the assumption I think first starts with that these Western categories are universal, right? So
Right. Right.
and you're like, well, are they? I mean, like they're founded in the West, they only really developed in the Western mind. So like, are we really talking about everybody? Like, you don't think these, like, why don't we have stories like the Oedipal story in the Indian context? We don't have it. We have different relationships that we've built out over time. Chinese have their own relationships. These aren't reified categories
that
are universal.
It's really interesting. I've been thinking about this very deeply the last couple of days. And Wendy, of course, emerges from this kind of Levi-Straussian idea about myths, and which, of course, links to Jung, and which, of course, in a funny way, links to, now I'm really going all over the place here, like Aldous Huxley and perennialism.
Yeah, sure.
Right, and the mind at large, and so like you have these great theories that stipulate that there are these grand sort of situations that we all human beings are sort of part of in some way, and it's a wonderful thing, right? I mean, it's great that brings us all together, but is it just the importation of a Western category? And then if so, then it just becomes a perpetuation of a kind of colonial mentality and dichotomy. Right. Like we figured it out, and you haven't figured it out yet, but we know. And that's a kind of like Unitarianism or perennialism. It's a very peculiar thing. Dare I say it, like Advaita Vedanta.
It is funny because I a lot of times, even in these Western scholars that come and look at Indian texts, you still find that blind adherence to Cartesian dualism. Yeah. And it's as if like their own senses, even though reading an Indian text, Indian dualism, I'm not even talking about Madhva here. I'm talking about the nature of the mind as being physical in and of itself, as opposed to oneself, right? Like there's like this,
the good old manas, the good old manas, right? You could like pop it out with a shoehorn,
right? But it's within the Indian context, Hindu context. It's a physical thing. It's part of physical nature. It's part of one's phenomenal self, as we can say, right? But it's not part of one's quote unquote ultimate self. So you have a very different understanding of then what the mind is. Yes, as opposed to the West, the mind becomes the extension of oneself at their truest core, right? Where for us, it's like, okay, it's like any other sense, the inner organ, as they call it.
No, it's complicated. So I'm somehow reminded, and I'll see if I can connect it. He's of course past, but J.C. Smith's articles about religion, religious, where he thinks that religion is a kind of a creation of the academic scholar, right? And so in this funny way, I think that sometimes I think about scholarship in general, not just scholarship on Hinduism or Indian philosophy, as the same sort of thing, is that you're kind of inventing this category, and then you're seeing things, you're cherry picking stuff to analyze and make it fit. But this, of course, I'm sure you'd agree, connects both Nagarjuna and constructivism, right? Right.
But this is the same thing you said right now was Dr. Jeffrey Long. We had him on last week. Said the same exact thing about the nature of religion being constructed by scholars as opposed to on the ground what people actually do. Right.
He's there's an interesting thing when scholars, outside scholars, become more native than native scholars, and it's super complicated. Super complicated.
Trust me, there's like
I'm sure you've seen my piece, or if you haven't, now everybody should look at it. That white Hindu converts.
Yes.
Which I wrote about Jeff Long.
Yeah.
That's who I wrote about. Jeff, if you're out there, I wrote it about you. You know it.
But I'm sure you know him
that was
too.
A long time ago. What's that?
I'm sure you know him personally, right? So
I haven't talked to him in a decade.
Oh wow.
Yeah. But so I mean, but he marks an interesting time in Hindu and Hindu studies in the AAR when you had like suddenly a critical mass of converts who became the voice of Hinduism.
Right. But that's always the case, isn't it? And then
I don't know. Then you had all this complicated debate about caste and class and whether Hinduism is something that's universalizable. It was a really bad time. I mean, it still is, I'm sure. But I mean, I hardly go to the AAR. I hardly do anything with RISA anymore. I had to step down from RISA after I wrote that article.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I got ostracized.
Yeah, like it's a very politically it's a complicated world in that sense. Like I find a lot of scholarship today, like especially amongst probably scholars my age, maybe a little younger, and it's weird and it might sound terrible, but like a lot of mostly it's from like South Indian Brahmin women scholars in the West have become like this. They're playing two sides here. I feel like they're studying the text, but they're also bringing with them the colonized view on everything. It's always either Marxism comes to bear or feminism comes to bear, which, you know, like I could absolutely say like a text and like many of the ancient texts have elements of misogyny, they have elements of casteism, Varnaism, whatever you want to call it, but they're not only that. There's multiple places where there's multiple responses to that.
Right. I think that to be fair to all scholars, right, is that there's the economy of the academic world is a peculiar one.
Yeah.
Right. And how you gain cultural capital, how you get enrollments, and how you give yourself a voice and emerge as an important figure depends on, you know, what is the current trend or what is the current cachet, right?
Sure.
So, and if you want to get tenure and if all these things, so it's you know, it's only after you become a full professor that you can write and
say what you want. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I remember when I became full professor, I reached out to my my mentor and friend, Frank Clooney, and I said, Frank, what does it mean to become a full professor? Like, what is the stage here? And Frank said to me, you can write whatever you want, not what others want you to write.
Right. So which is I love Frank Clooney's work. I think his work is fantastic.
He's a wonderful person.
I had him on the podcast.
Oh, you did? That's fantastic. I love you, Frank, wherever you are.
Yeah, he's fantastic. My only point about that primarily was that what and it connects to this point is just I feel today because of the politicized nature of like India and like there's quote unquote Hindutva everywhere. Like, and I don't really care about Hindutva. Like I'm on either side. I just it doesn't matter.
I'm sorry. I have friends I have friends of friends who've been killed.
By in India.
Yeah, BJP reporters, you know, like it's a complicated place.
It's a complicated.
I have a letter someplace. Maybe it's at work where there was a death threat against me by the VHP. I mean, it's a complicated place.
Yeah, I mean, so I get all that. And India is a mess of a place. It's always been a mess of a place. But I feel like so outside of it becomes as if like there's one thing to be like, I'm not interested. You're not a fan of Hindutva. That's fine. I don't really care about politically. Politically, I just don't care about Hindutva.
Yeah, it's cool. Go on. Care.
But what happens is scholarship becomes utterly influenced by that hatred that anything coming out of the scholarship is connected to that. Well, this is the Hindutva project. Well, like decolonization is a very complicated thing, right? And it's not simply exactly what I'm saying. I 100% TM. I 100% get it. It's a complicated process because it's as if we're trying to find our past, but we're given the tools of what we have, which is the tools of the West anyway. And we're trying to wade through that to find a way to come back to what our native understanding is or knowledge base, whatever it is. It's not an easy thing. And it's going to be complicated by historical relationships. India, relationship with Muslims, with Christians, with secular world and perspectives. And I feel like some of the scholarship makes it as if it's just black and white when it's all muck.
Well, I think that that sometimes scholarship is like legalese. It has to be black and white. And I think that certainly for more junior scholars or scholars who want to make a bigger name for themselves, that coming down hard on positions, drawing attention to themselves, making arguments is important for their academic survival.
Right.
I'm trying to be careful here. Is that am I trying to be careful? I am entirely skeptical of the entire academic enterprise, and and I think of Nagarjuna here, is that this is all kind of conventional nonsense. And
Right.
people are getting good at language games and playing those language games, and they gain cultural capital. And suddenly everybody wants to hear them, and they publish, and they become an expert in this, and they become big. And that all is mostly black and white, right? Like you
Right.
have, right? And so I see all of these kinds of things happening. And the kind of shared goal of creating knowledge and enjoying it is not quite the same thing. Haha, dare I say it, as it used to be.
Sure.
But it's funny. I always whack. I'm nostalgic about like when I was first on AAR at the AAR and on RISA in like 1994. I think 1994 was when I gave my first paper to AAR, and there were only like 30 of us, maybe 40 of us.
Right.
And that was it. And like there were only 2 panels or 3 panels. We all gathered, we all contributed, we all enjoyed each other's company, and we all went to eat together. Now there's like, I don't know, maybe 20 panels every day about something South Asia, and they're all so in their own world. You have all of these internal politics, internal dialogues, and they all are vying for FaceTime.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Maybe I really wonder if this is a combination of my skepticism and my being jaded, and now I'm so senior that I don't participate anymore. I just watch it from afar.
Right. Right.
And by the way, I want to make a plug here. I just needed to mention this.
Sure.
Is that unless somebody in the kind of internet world can tell me otherwise, I'm the first Indian American PhD on Hinduism and Indian philosophy in the United States. Right. I'm the first one. No one else came. I graduated in 98. Nobody else was Indian American like me and did it before that. So I was certainly the first Indian American Hindu to go to the Divinity School through Chicago. Right. So
that's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, I tried telling, what's his name? I don't remember his name, but there's a young scholar who's got the Ilyada chair now. I don't remember his name. And he was writing something about the history of South Asians and South Asian studies in America. And I told him, like, do you know who I am? And he didn't know. And kind of like groups of younger scholars than me were all so excited about how they were located with the academic world. And, I was trying to tell him, like, I forged that path.
Yeah.
It was funny. I was the first Indian American on RISA. And that's why it was interesting. It was a nice time. There's only 25, 30 of us.
Well, that's really fascinating that, that you're the only Indian American you were
at that time
about studying your own tradition, and everyone else is like this outsider looking in and telling you what the religion is.
Right. And it was fun. I remember people like Jack Hawley so excited that I was studying it too. And he was telling me, like, I have students who are like you, because we were only becoming of age then, right? Like I was 21 then, and people like Jack Hawley and others, like I was the first batch of kids to go through college, right? I mean, not the first, but among the first, right? 1969 birth, 1968 immigrant. And so it was a lot of fun. I was probably like a funny kind of experiment for the people in RISA.
Yeah. And 10 years, you're 69, I was 79. So I think with my generation, you find much more people going in, but not many people go into the study, especially Indian Americans don't go into the study of religion.
You're not going to make a buck off of this.
Yeah, that's true.
You're not going to make a buck off of it. Be the Indian community, like the great irony, and it's the greatest irony that I've faced ever, is that like that on the one hand, the Indian community is like, you have to follow dharma and be.
Yeah.
And so I did that, right? But I don't have any cultural capital. I'm whining, I know, but it's so strange. Like I go to something and people are like, they think I'm a priest, which means I'm low down on the totem pole, and I don't get any credit for studying what they said that I should study.
Yeah, right? it is this weird thing. I've noticed that too.
But on the other hand, like people who are kind of more in the kind of more elite in that scene know that have done something interesting. It's just that, it's, I am sure, no, I'm not sure, but it's funny to say that I am the kind of Indian that you wouldn't want your child to become.
Well, I don't know if that's true in some sense. Yeah. I think like.
No, that's good. Thank you for defending me.
No, absolutely. Because like I'm doing what I do now, like my career, just because I got to pay the bills and whatever. But my desire is to do what you do. not in institution or university, because I don't really care about like the institution of things. Like I know there's capital that comes with having the PhD behind your name, as opposed to just being me who can read Sanskrit probably as good as most professors in the university. But I don't have that PhD. So I have the JD, which, you know, I whatever, I'm a lawyer.
Cool too.
But but the expertise that comes with this allows you to speak with some level of authority that people do listen to, right? Like,
it's exciting. I mean, in the last few years, I've gotten a much louder voice. I'm on TV. Random people call me up and do podcasts. I mean, and I'm going to be speaking at Chautauqua next week, right? So, you know, it's cool. Like I you know, people care what I have to say, and I am even more vocal than before. I just got named this inaugural chair in the public humanities at Case.
Congratulations.
Thank you. My friend, the provost, who's no longer the provost here at Case, he's now the president at Howard University, Ben Vinson, he said to me that he could see that I was kind of gaining a voice and I needed to have no restraints. And he thought by, you know, naming me this way, you know, to have no constraints and I could speak to these larger and larger worlds. I mean, this Chautauqua, I think that the same day that I'm speaking at Chautauqua, Sanjay Gupta is speaking. 500 people are supposed to come to my talk. Like I can have an impact. I can have an effect. I can make people think. I can, and it's you know, this is a whole nother kind of different place in my career now. I'm not curious about arguing Vedanta at the AAR with young up-and-coming assistant professors. Now I'm thinking about much grander, different sorts of things.
Like you have like, what would you be thinking about now that's that you would say is grander?
Right. So I think that this particular phase of my work right now, and some of the people have been reaching out to me, is thinking about psychedelics and entheogens. And I'll say something a little bit in kind of in anticipation, and in anticipation of the Chautauqua talk, is that Chautauqua is set up that they have like weekly conversations and topics, and this next week, which will be the week 9, I think it is, or something like that, is about the global North and the global South, and about those kind of relationships, right? And they want me to speak about it, though, from a more theological point of view, right? And about how to generate unity and ways of thinking about like the one world, right? So I actually am going to speak a little about that talk then, right? Is it that I find this so fascinating that, in brief, that substances like DMT and psilocybin, which emerge from the global South, like they are global South phenomena, and have their own particular context where these substances, and I would call them entheogens, were consumed and are consumed. And they were discovered by the West, made into pharmaceutical phenomena, and have, rather than decreasing the dichotomy between the global South and global North, have just reified it. Right? In the same way that people go to India and have discovered spices or whatever the hell it is, right? It's the same damn thing, except that now the indigenous people who discovered these are not getting compensated when they want to get compensated, and it's, of course, being used in this therapeutic scenario, right? And in these therapeutic scenarios, just as you have already marked, is that these therapeutic allopathic medical scenarios are their own episteme, they're their own language, right? And and what was embraced, shall we say, in the among the Mazatecs or the indigenous Amazonians is regarded as a side effect, right? So what is embraced is kind of the entheogenic quality of these substances, which, and here comes, if you're going to Chautauqua, I'm going to give you the punchline here, people, is that DMT and psilocybin create the sensation and the experience, call it a mystical experience, if you like, where you want unity and you want oneness in the world. And there's something so ironic about this, is that those capacities are only regarded as side effects or as valuable for kind of having a therapeutic, right? And it's the greatest hypocrisy and irony.
It is utterly fascinating. I mean, the way you're playing, because I myself have taken psilocybin and LSD and whatever, so I've experienced.
DMT?
I haven't yet, no. So
but California's full of people doing ayahuasca. You should look.
Yeah. I mean, like, I also I do it again with purpose. It's never about like recreationally, like just to go party and hang out. That's not what I do. I do it when I spiritualize everything. Like I do like mantras and all that stuff. But
dude, that's cool. That's pretty good.
So I think this is utterly interesting to me in the regard that you, first of all, you brought up is these entire herbs or chemicals, whatever you want to call them, are used in the modern context like as if they're another sort of panacea that you can hand out to people for whatever ails you or how to address it, as opposed to the way I think indigenously they were consumed as a way to bring people together, unify in experience. Like, you know, like even yoga, for example, like when we talk about yoga, how it's, if you go to India, like a yoga teacher doesn't really charge you. You just do yoga with them and then you give dakshina at the end. I've done that before. But here it's like this, you turn this into a product, you sell it, you commercialize it, you commodify it. And that's just not just with yoga, but like, you know, vipassana and meditation. You know,
let
like
me add this. Is that these practices like yoga or the use of psychedelics in the allopathic context for therapy, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to say this, make us happy workers.
Yes, I agree. It's all meant for that.
It's all meant for that, right?
I mean, like, I like Sam Harris, but I'm also like, yo, dude, you have this app you created where you're selling these spiritual things in commodified ways, but you love to talk about spirituality. I'm like, a thing has to be, in and of itself, once you commercialize and commoditize it, it's no longer sacred. It becomes something you can barter. And I think this is where, like, these experiences, what we're doing now is bartering experiences.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But remember, too, that in your reference to Nagarjuna and his kind of bhakti, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that there are lots of religions who do all that, who make commodities, too. Like you demand a tithe, you sell books.
Sure.
You ask for a guru dakshina, right? So finally, you know, what is left?
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between saying like a dakshina is something that what you value, that thing you give to your guru, you know, or whatever it is, as opposed to it's purely commercial. And like the nature of like, but there's like the commercial nature removes a sacredness to it. Like the object no longer has value in and of itself.
That's funny you say that. Is that when I was writing and thinking about this, is that when is it fair? Is it okay for the Western allopathic researcher or clinician to use these substances out of context? And I connected this in my head, and now I'm going to write about it, really thinking about Iliada and the sui generis nature of the sacred, the irreducibility of the sacred. And I wondered if that was something that was applicable, or if there was something that then was off limits, is that no, you can't use these substances and use them for these therapeutic and capitalist kind of economies because they had sacred value for somebody, right? And of course, we have to consider that the word sacred is some Western construction too, right? So it's a real mess. And I want to say just for a second, because I'm not sure if what your listeners are thinking, is that my job is not to offer any answers. It's only to problematize things. That's
right.
That is it. And if I have problematized your presuppositions and confused you a little bit, maybe changed your mind or recognized the weakness of your position, then I've done my job.
Yeah. Well, that's very well put for, I think, what scholarship should be doing, right? It should be problematizing and engaging with how to maybe shift your mind and think a little differently. And
I agree. I think, if I may again, I wrote a Huff piece for the Huffington Post called "What Makes a University Great," and I suggest that your readers look at that.
Sure.
And I think that let me just connect these in an interesting way, is that my job is to take you, imagine you are like a snow globe, and help shake you up, and then see how things fall. And of course, people have used that language when they talk about the neuroplasticity of entheogens and psychedelics.
Right. Yeah.
So if my class is trippy, then I've done my job.
Very good. Well, I mean, this has been like a long, good introduction, and we've kind of got through many topics, but I kind of do want to talk a little bit about Dvaita Vedanta here.
Oh,
I know.
Sure.
I'll
do the best I can.
No, absolutely. So
you should ask the author of this book.
I mean, no. I mean, your interests have shifted and moved, like as any scholar should, right? No one sticks to one subject for the most part. You have to kind of move around a little bit.
If you're a Western scholar, maybe, or if you're a particular kind of Western scholar. But in India, people would be focused. I mean, the scholars at the Vidyapeetham don't shift their focus, right?
Well, I mean, they'll go somewhere else within the tradition. Like, for example, they might go from being epistemology focused to ontology or whatever, right?
But their focus is always, I want to say, vocational, to argue against Advaita. And
yeah. But that's because the nature of Madhva's tradition is it fundamentally antagonistic to Advaita, right? So can you tell us, let's just start, like, what is Dvaita?
What is Dvaita? Dvaita Vedanta, Madhva Vedanta, is a system of thought in the tradition of Vedanta, which offers a commentary on the Vedas and on Shruti that conclude that that Brahman, Vishnu, and human beings are different. They're not the same as they are in Advaita, and they're not some in-between thing as in Vishishtadvaita. And so consequently, everything that you see around you is real. It's not a projection of the mind. It is not a product of Maya. It is not Chitta Matra, mind only. Of course, Advaita is just quasi-Buddhism. We know all that. Right? But, right.
They call it Prachanda Bodha, right?
So it's a realism with the theism, and an attempt to argue against Advaita Vedanta in that way. I think that's what I would say it is very broadly, and that there's an essential element of bhakti in there, where proper bhakti towards Vishnu, who is regarded as separate from you and as all-powerful, could result in moksha if you are one of the chosen. And as I've argued, that even bhakti is graded, so to speak. There's a hierarchy in bhakti, and people who have more access to the texts, who might already be the more chosen, are going to have a more refined bhakti experience.
Okay. I mean, let's just kind of jump in a little deeper. So when we say, what would you say are, like, when you say the world is real, what does that mean?
That means that objects exist outside of your mind, and they're not mind only as they are in, say, the Yogacara school. And that they are distinct from you, they're tangible, they're real, right? As opposed to the idealism of Advaita Vedanta, where finally everything is Brahman, and the differences that you see, like between me and my cup, are not real, finally. And all of those involve a bi-level epistemology, the real and the real behind the real. If we think of it in Kantian terms, conventional, ultimate, we're thinking about that in Buddhist and Advaita terms.
Like Vyavaharik Paramarthik.
That's exactly right.
So within the Dvaita Vedanta, then, what is the nature of the world to Brahman, right? Is it the world a substance that is separate, utterly separate? And if so, what's its origin? Is it eternal? Is it momentary?
Right. That's another great question. And I think that that these are all separate entities, and they exist eternally, right? So there's no, so Madhvacharya does something interesting here about creation. I mean, although humans and jivas rather are dependent upon Vishnu, he doesn't attribute creation to Vishnu quite so explicitly. And that absolves Vishnu then of any kind of, evil or theodicy, right? So there's a little interesting sorts of what I call mitigated monotheism, I think, in my book.
So what does that mean? If Vishnu doesn't create the world, how does the world come to be? How does the world maintain itself and move forward? And
Right.
That's
So I think that there's jada, right? So there's like material stuff, and that exists. Like I always think of it as like like independent kind of entities that exist, right?
Mhm.
And they're the relationship between both of those, Jiva and Jada and Vishnu, is dependence, right? So that they're utterly dependent on Vishnu. So for them to function, Vishnu has to let that happen, right?
okay.
Right? But there's less interest and curiosity about origins. And I'll cite the Buddhists on this one, and I'll cite and worry about Aquinas at the same time. Is that Western scholars and Western scholarship has always been interested in origins.
Mhm.
Why? They have a problem with infinity, right? So you have this, not the car, but the concept is that you can't have, according to Aquinas, an infinite number of causes. There has to be a first cause, right? Whereas I think that the schools of Indian philosophy, broadly speaking, and certainly Buddhism, don't care so much about the cause. They want to know how to get out of this mess. And so the classic example is that you've got an arrow in your chest, like you go to the emergency room or something like that. If you tell the attendant, don't take it out unless we know who shot it, their money. Like no, just like stop it. Give him some Thorazine and pull it out or something. Like I don't like so that but that also leads to this really great question, like, is Indian philosophy, right? And as I said, and I did not mean it as a denigrate, as in a way to kind of denigrate it, but what we see in India is vocational. It's like people are arguing for the sake of their moksha, not as a result of publish or perish. Right. Like and so these questions about origins is a Western philosophical question. And is Indian philosophy, or is it darshan or anvikshiki? Hobfass has written very nicely about this. And how do you get it taken seriously? Well, you call it a philosophy. So it's funny, when I teach my introduction to Indian philosophy, students, I have students who have some Western training, and they come in with kind of imperialist muscles to try and impose their categories on things. Sure. And I let them for a while, and I use words like epistemology instead of pramana theory and so on. And as we progress, I ask them, is this philosophy? And sometimes they're willing to embrace that it is not. But oftentimes when they think that it's not, they also put it into a hierarchy and they say it's a religion, right? Or they say something else to make it less valuable or less of a player, shall we say. And so I think that these questions about origins isn't something that is particularly Indian or Hindu in the same way. And it's important. Why? Because people don't like the infinity.
I think that's such an interesting point, because I have thought about that a lot, because when you read theology, the problem of theodicy comes down to some of this, right? The origin of the self. Why does man exist? How did God create them? Why did God create them? Then therefore, like, is God's all knowing, all powerful? Then all actions must fall onto him. So these ideas of even like, even when I was talking to Chakravarti Ramprasad on these issues, is this is what just wasn't interesting to the Indian mind. Like, they would say creation is anadi, right? All this is all this is from infinite past. I think that's their way of saying, like you said, who cares? Like it's who cares where it comes from, how it come. Your situation right now is one of suffering. How do you want to get on it? Do you want to keep going down this path, or do you want out? Right. So it's a serotonological kind of engagement.
Indeed, it's about having the right cognitive habits. Right cognitive habits, which is a little bit like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right. No, which is why these practices are like really focused on the nature of the distinction between mind and self, right? At the deepest core. Even bhakti at that sense is like separating yourself from that momentary mind game that you're playing with yourself and focusing on this deeply core experience of bliss, or whatever you want to call it.
Bliss and devotion, right? I think that it's a real danger. But we're back to that same question that we spoke about some time ago about the importation of Western methods and theories and categories to look at these materials.
Sure.
And by the end of the semester, when I teach Indian philosophy, two things are happening. One of them is that I'm using mostly Sanskrit terminology rather than English terminology. And then when we read Nagarjuna, that the students finally realized something very substantial, is that the whole class has been a kind of a construction because we're doing most of it in English.
Right.
And really the only way to do this is do this in Sanskrit. And
Yeah.
once they see this, they recognize that these categories are all very peculiar. We start looking at the Sanskrit more than, or Tibetan or whatever language, more closely than the English. And I always teach Nagarjuna at the end of the semester, so it gets all combined with kind of the utility of language, the problematic nature of any category, and then I leave them with nothing.
Do you get into the Mimamsaka's retort to
No.
Nagarjuna's?
You know, I'm sorry to say that I don't teach any Puramimamsa or Uttaramimamsa, and I might do that, but I do something a little bit like I have to admit, people out there, I admit this, it's a little Elliot Deutsche, right? Is that finally I extricate the philosophical stuff so that we don't have to worry about Shruti, right? Is that once you go down the Vedanta route, the Mimamsa route, then you're just looking at Shruti and, like, you know, and it's all interesting hermeneutical gymnastics, and the students are just not that interested in that. They're just not interested,
but it's interesting to me at the same point, like the Madhyamika tradition itself is built around this Shruti of Buddha Vakya, right? Like ultimately we all are, even though everything is constructed, we have to have some basis for believing in what we believe or engaging in the world, right?
Finally, I wish that I leave the semester, right?
Yeah.
Doing, you know, I'm extricating the Nagarjuna from Buddhism, right? And a lot of people get accused of this. And they say, like, why the hell did he even talk about karma?
Yeah.
Or I just do what I like call an upaya move, right? Is that like, so, right? Do I need to say more? Is that so consequently, like anything you said earlier about like Bhakti Buddhism, I'm like just doing that because he's trying to invite you in. He's like, there's some ice cream. Would you like it? It's weekend, right? Come on. So I often say that Nagarjuna, I wonder and wish that Nagarjuna outside of the Buddhist box is finally like this pure skepticism, borderline nihilism. And I should say, and I should send a shout out to Paul Griffiths, is that when I used to do this in grad school, I remember I did this in my first year, he told me that it was such a dangerous, slippery slope to think of Nagarjuna as nihilism, because it leads you to wonder if you should be in graduate school at all, and you might end up getting a head injury in the process.
Yeah, that's funny. No, I mean, when my engagement with Nagarjuna, I was almost nihilistic in that sense too, right? It can lead you to almost to the edge, and that he does that move of shifting shunya to nirvana and flipping it around and saying basically it's all the same.
It's
the
beautiful.
Same. Yeah.
Right. But I tend to, like, when I am more at peace and more in tune and more meditative, I think exactly that way.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, and now I'm going to do something that you did not even expect to happen. Is that on Saturday, I went and saw Barbie, this film.
Okay.
And it was Nagarjuna and constructivism. Right. It was fabulous. So I saw this and neuroplasticity all at once. It was brilliant. It's so I see this everywhere. And I think that these constructions, and I tend to think and combine this with a social justice issue, right? Which is that these constructions have only been there to oppress. People attach themselves to it and they oppress others with them, right? And they use them all the time to do that. It's true that I have to walk around sometimes conventionally, and when the light is red, I should stop, right? But finally, when it comes to my own suffering and my own control over my my kind of, well, I would just say my own suffering, is that by far this is the most convincing and best explanation, right? And it gives tremendous freedom. It gives you also compassion for others who can't let go of their construction, right? Or who hold on to their construction and suffer because of it, right?
So what is Madhva's response to what suffering is then?
Suffering, he'll say it's your karma, right? It's predestination, right? It's your karma. right? You know, it's funny you say that, is that when I went to India right after my head injury, and I remember telling the scholars at Vidyapeetham that I had a head injury, right? And I told them my story. And they could see that sometimes I was showing signs of that. Like I had to record everything they said, not just because what they said was interesting, but because I had short-term memory loss. It was a very peculiar time. And they would say, you know, like, this was your karma, right? Just like you would imagine to say this. And they would say this, but look at your karma, it has brought you here to study with us, right? So, you know, suffering, of course, for Madhvacharya is if you read it as a kind of hard predestination, is what you had once coming to you. But as I wrote about this, and I wrote about this it was a really hard paper to write, but I wrote about karma and suffering in the context of the Indian medical student who was so terribly raped and abused in
Nirbhaya.
Yeah. And I wrote about that, like, so how do you explain this, right? And in the Hindu context, it's karma, right? Which does this really screwed up thing of blaming the victim.
Does it?
Sure. It's your karma that ended up this way, right?
Well, so this is where I'll push back a little bit, is cool. I think the concept of karma, as I've understood it, is not about you, right? These are the plays of Prakriti and nature as cause and effect. Some cause led to this effect. The you yourself as the Atma or Jiva or whatever is not a doer per se, right? You're quote unquote enjoyer bhokta. So you haven't caused this situation. The problem is the identity, associative nature of the Jiva associating with this particular set of karma bundles, right? Of cause and effect bundles that causes that suffering, right? It's like, you know, I do the best way I give analogy is you're playing a video game, the character on the screen happens to match your movements on your hand,
right?
But the character on the screen is like has its own emotional background story, whatever, but you suddenly become immersed with it where you start feeling it.
I understand. Right. But I'd say that the issue of agency and karma is I'll say that it's a super complicated one.
For sure.
There's a continuum. You have no agency, you have some agency.
Yeah.
Right. And you are clearly portraying something that's on that continuum. Where's that book? Now, maybe it's my office at school, but there's some great work that people have done. I think the jury is out on this one.
Sure.
Right? I think the jury is out. Right. And when I wrote that article, I wrote it from a strong Madhva perspective, which is predestination, which finally puts the blame in this really screwed up way on her for something she did in the past. Right.
Sure.
So,
but how would the Buddhists explain it? How would that be different?
I think the Buddhists have all of these lists of what, if you do this, you end up like that, right? So they have tremendously long lists about conventional reality and karmic relations, right? Same with the Jains, right? Like you do this, you step on a bug and you get reborn as, you know, like there's tremendous awareness of these, or not awareness, speculation. It's not speculation, I believe it's true.
Sure.
Of this. So I think that I would say that karma as a theodicy, right, is demanding, right? Just in the same way that if I told you the expression that I use with my students is the MWC clause, right? Is that God works in mysterious, rather MWC, mysterious ways clause. God works in mysterious ways. Why did this bad thing happen to you?
Sure.
God works in mysterious ways,
right?
Which is just as satisfying as saying like there's you had some agency in this happening to you, right? But maybe the best Buddhist response that Nagarjuna would give on that level is that like, well, did these things happen to anyone?
Right. It is basically the erasure of suffering.
It is an erasure of suffering, right? It's
right.
It's like having the right cognitive habit, you won't have it, or you won't suffer from it, or you
right.
And you know, I think a friend of mine was recently reminding me that suffering is temporary, right? Like whatever you're experiencing is like you have an attachment to the permanence of it, but it's not permanent.
But that's the same thing with happiness too. It's fleeting. It's momentary.
You gotta be Madhyamika, right?
Yeah. No, but I mean, but these are all the same positions held by Hindus and Jains too.
Absolutely, and Buddhists, yeah.
Yeah. So
No
across
doubt.
the board, it's just like this.
Or
Yeah.
theoretically, like your average Hindu, Jain, Buddhist is not thinking this way. They're just going around eating,
No,
chaat.
of course not. Yeah, of course, right? Like most people are not engaged in this endeavor of trying to understand their mind and suffering and pain
Yeah.
and
This is by
happiness.
far. Yeah, this is by
We're
far
just too busy chasing it. We're just too
chasing it,
busy
yeah.
chasing it, right?
As my students in the Indian philosophy class, some of them finally get so frustrated. They said, "This is the most ivory tower thing I've ever done." I said, "Yes, it is. It is."
No, but it is. So the thing with Madhva's tradition that I find pretty interesting is it's one of the only traditions in the Indian subcontinent to really be non-dualistic in any way, shape, or form. In that sense of like
not non-dualistic. You mean
yeah,
dualistic?
non-dualistic. No, sorry.
Yeah.
It's the only one to be.
Ulta.
Yeah. It's the only one that's not a non-dualist. Yeah.
Though, Sankhya it's got its own dualism in its
Yeah,
own.
but I mean that depends if you're looking at Ishvara Krishna Sankhya versus like
This is true. Yeah, this is true. But yeah, you're right. It's dualist, right? In opposition to Shankaracharya and Vishishtadvaita. And interestingly enough, like there are scores of people in India who are dualist, but most Western scholars want to only see Shankaracharya.
Yeah, as the philosophy of
as
India.
the default, as the default. Right?
Yeah. So in that sense, so I know there's this term called Panchabeda, right? Within the Madhva tradition. What is that exactly?
Panchabeda. Panchabeda.
Panchabeda,
Yeah. What is that? That's the 5 kinds of differences. Let me see what I wrote here. I feel like I should read it here. It's a long time I wrote this. When did I write this book? 2003? That's 20 years ago, man. That's a long time ago. I don't even remember what happened yesterday, right? And you're asking me to tell you what happened. No, I'm kidding. But like that was a long time ago. Panchabeda. Well, it must be someplace in this book. Yeah, so the 5 kinds of differences, self and stuff, self and God, like that.
Right? Okay.
2 more. Does that help?
No, it does help.
I'm not laughing at Madhva Vedanta here. So please, people out there, don't think I'm laughing. It's just that this is not so much the work that I'm doing anymore.
No, and I totally understand that.
I'm glad you do. Yeah. I'm gonna lose a whole constituency.
Well, first, I hope not. I hope people are listening and find all this interesting, the conversation on the whole. We'll get inklings of Madhva Vedanta throughout this, but we'll get more of your thought process of not only academia, but the nature of like Hindu thought and in the Western world, right? That's again, some of the stuff we touch upon through our larger conversations with other scholars. So there's a couple concepts I actually think are really fascinating within the Madhva tradition that are unique to Madhva. One, I think, is the idea that within the tradition itself, that there are different classes of jivas based on the fact that some are going to be, some are already released or always been released, all the way down to people that will never be released, which I don't think any other tradition talks about this.
No, it sure looks like, no other tradition talks like this. And it really is this interesting kind of predestination. And you see parallels, of course, of this in Calvinism.
Sure.
So people have done all this speculation. Nobody has a hell that you never get out of.
Right.
And the names of those are so funny and hilarious, like the heated clay pot, or they're really funny. But yeah, no one else has anything like that, right? So I always, although born the way I am, you would think that I'm a mukti yogya, but I always wondered if I'm really tama yogya.
So let me on this gradation here. The group known as Nitya Samsaris, or the ones that I think are the ones that are supposed to be stuck in the circle of samsara forever and ever. And then there's the group called, I think, Nityanaraka.
Yeah.
But the question, I mean, on this regard is, what is even though Vishnu is supposed to be all loving in the sense, and I've heard other madhus say that even the people that are in quote unquote hell forever, hell isn't the conception of like this evil, terrible place, but it's this idea of separation from Vishnu, and you don't have the light of Vishnu, and Vishnu gives you what you want. So
well, yeah, something like that. I remember hearing that people who that they're destined to be there. This is who they are supposed to be.
right.
So they're I wouldn't say happy there, but that's where they should end up, right?
Okay.
And so everybody is where they should be, and they're in a hierarchy in relationship to Vishnu, right? And so I wouldn't say that people in hell are happy, but the people in hell, this is where they'll be happiest.
Yes.
You know, I think about like Indians moving to Florida, right? Like they like it very hot. They like it very hot, right? You don't have probably too many Indians that move to
Alaska. Yeah.
Right. So, but even there, though, even Florida, they'll run their AC. It's true. But you know, people end up where they need to be, and they're happier there, right? So you know, I actually wrote about this. I gave a talk about this in Lisbon, I think, about how there is no evil then, right? Like you are just playing out your karmic destiny, and
Yeah.
it's like you're a bad person, but there's not evil in the way that there is evil in Christianity, right? So yeah, that was a really strange paper that I wrote. Yeah, it's online, translated into Portuguese.
So it's interesting because when I think about this, like the idea, if you have infinite souls, infinite number of souls, and infinite kinds of varieties of souls, you have to have at some level some souls that do not want to be around Vishnu in that
Yeah.
world. They want their own existence, separate
Yeah.
from and whatever that entails.
Yeah, you know, when I studied with Bananje, he always explained this in terms of a class, right? Is that when I'm teaching Indian philosophy, I have some students who sit in the front and want to learn the materials and love it being there.
Yeah.
And then I have some students who took it as an add-on or because it was some requirement that they need to fill, and they don't really want to be there at all.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't show up, or they don't do the work, and they get the grade they deserve. Right. And when I give them a C or a D, they don't dispute it. They're like, you know, yeah, this is what I expected anyway. Right. And so, and you have to teach all of them. The ones that are at the top are going to understand it in a very different way and be committed in a different way.
Sure.
They're sitting in front. The ones in the back are not paying attention and are sitting in the back. Right. And then there's still those who won't take the class at all.
Right. Very interesting. And then another topic that I think is fascinating for me is the idea of Sakshi in Madhva, which is very
the witness, this epistemic certainty kind of thing. It's very
So can you explain that, because that's not found in any other tradition that I'm used to. I've read.
Yeah, let me see what I wrote. Okay, I'm so sorry, readers. You're probably looking at my book too.
I will put the book and your lectures on the show notes so people can
see.
find
What
you.
did it say? Sakshi. I have pages 24 through 30, which was really poorly done. I should have been more specific. All right. Manas slide. The 5 sense organs send their data, corrupt or otherwise, to the manas, which serves to organize them. Though the manas is a sense organ, it gets and coordinates information from the other 5. The manas lies in the middle of the cognitive hierarchy, and in turn, the knowledge it generates is the object of the sakshi, the internal witness. The end result of the observation of the knowledge deriving from the physical sense organs by the sakshi via the manas is pratyaksha, perceptual cognition. What else do I say here? The Sakshi, internal witness, is perhaps the most important component of the Chinese epistemology. Anyway, I'm having a good time. What to make? Perceptual cognition has several layers, and the Sakshi is the innermost one. The Indriyas are at the outermost layer, the Manas is in the middle, and the Sakshi is at the core. In fact, it refers to the basic level of reflective consciousness, experience, and awareness that every sentient being possesses. A parallel concept in Western philosophy can be found in Descartes' Meditations. Descartes, this is interesting. Descartes suggests that, though there is little certainty in our knowledge, it is nonetheless possible to be certain of one's own existence. This reminds me of a self-validating pramana.
Yeah.
After all, according to Descartes, self-reflection and thought, at the very least, proves that there is a knower. Hence his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum. The Sakshi serves an identical purpose in Madhva's epistemology as the experience and source of absolute certainty and awareness that there is a knower. As the conclusive adjudicator, Sakshi cannot err. Not only must the Sakshi exist, but it also follow that it is without dosha. Any defect would make the Sakshi as erroneous as the sixfold Indriyas and Manas. How interesting. Yeah, to avoid this, that would make the Sakshi as erroneous as the sixfold Indriyas and the Manas, therefore requiring another epistemic apparatus to serve as final judge of the truth. To avoid this problem, Madhvacharya holds the Sakshi as swa-prakasha, self-luminous and self-validating. How interesting. First cause.
So the Sakshi then is that like a quality of the self, or is it related to Prakriti, or is it related to Purusha or Jiva, or what?
I'll have to read on to see what I wrote. So I'm afraid I can't answer any more than that. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Interesting section. I didn't realize that. No, I must have realized it at one time. With certainty, I'm sure.
Right, with certainty.
I'm afraid that I have really moved very, very far away from this. I wrote this 20 years ago.
Yeah. No, that I mean, it's a long time ago, and you haven't done that much work on it in many, many years, so that makes sense. No, I mean, there's other questions like what is Vishnu's nature in the Madhva tradition that makes Vishnu worthy of being called God?
He's independent.
Is that the swatantra that's the most important quality?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I mean, the whole system relies on that hierarchy of his independence and everyone's subsequent dependence. Right? It's a system of pure hierarchy, and your relationship to Vishnu, whether or not you're going to get moksha or predestined and so on, every single thing is in a hierarchy of dependence.
Of dependence. And then what role does Lakshmi play, for example, in this?
She's interesting. She's the first, the most, or the second in command, shall we say, and is has special place and a special kind of devotion for Vishnu, right? So it's an interesting kind of place that Sri Lakshmi is there like that. And in a way, she's the most exalted devotee in a way.
Sure. So one of the things that's difficult for a lot of people with Dvaita is when you read the Upanishads and you look at Vedic texts. Yeah, you get these. The Upanishads give you a sense that they're talking about some sort of oneness. Now, right. How does Madhva explain that oneness away?
Right. And so there are some scholars in the past have written about this, true. But there's kind of classic arguments that Madhvas make about Sandhi, and it shouldn't be Tattvamasi, it should be At-Tattvamasi.
Sure.
So, and that all is interesting kind of Sanskritic gymnastics, right?
Sure.
Everybody has to make the text say what they want it to say. Right. And so there are similar passages that are more theistically oriented that Advaitins have to do something with it too. Right. So so I think that in the past, when I taught the Upanishads in my Hinduism, from my Hinduism book, I would try with very little success to suggest that there are lots of ways to read this and it could be At-Tattvamasi. Right. I think in this case, I think now when I teach it in this fall, I'm going to teach it as Tattvamasi, right? So I think that the artificiality of circumscribing a canon forces commentarial traditions like Vedanta, all of the different schools of Vedanta, to make sense out of something that conflicts, right? And then you have to engage in some kind of enormous and difficult and painful gymnastics to make things work.
Right.
I think that Tattvamasi seems pretty clear to me to be non-dualist, and Madhvas have to try and make it say something else.
Yeah.
Which came first, the position or the text, right? That's a good question. And if I take Madhva Vedanta as I've written in this book as a Madhva, then surely Vishnu has taught Madhvacharya, and so what Madhvacharya is saying is accurate. He has complete epistemic authority. If we take it as a historical tradition that appeared in time that had to respond to these particular texts, then everybody, Vishishta Dvaita, Dvaita, and Advaita, all had to do some peculiar kind of gymnastics to make the text make sense. Right? It's the difficulty of being a commentarial tradition.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's all there is to it, right? And circumscribing the text in that way.
Sure. So,
go ahead.
No, so my follow-up question to that is, what would be moksha within the Madhva tradition? What is the idea of moksha then? Why in Advaita it's like merger, Vishishta Advaita some sort of.
Usually the kind of description I give is that moksha is a bit like being at a rock concert, and that what's her name? That woman who's singing all Taylor Swift. So that if you have like a front row and VIP ticket, then you're clearly Mukti Yogya. If you don't know about the show at all, then you're Kama Yogya. And then the people who are Mukti Yoga are from the front row all the way up to the nosebleeds, right? And even among the nosebleeds, there are taller people standing in front of you. There might be some part of the architecture of the indoor stadium that prevents you from seeing. You still are having a good time.
Yeah.
So Vaikuntha is like this. It's a wonderful place that has Vishnu there, maybe like the Vatican. And some people have VIP tickets. Some people have nosebleeds. Some people are outside of the stadium, hearing it on the speaker and still dancing.
Yeah.
As I did when I went to the Greek theater sometimes in Berkeley.
Oh, yeah, that's right. No, I mean, in some sense, almost everyone's partaking in some level of Vishnu. There's just some gradation is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's gradation in moksha indexed to your bhakti. Absolutely. Just as Bananjay Gondachar used to say, is that when you grade your papers, even there is a distinction with the A+ students.
Right. There's 98, 97, whatever. Yeah.
There are some that are the very best, and or the best in the class, right? So it's funny here at Case Western Reserve University, we don't have pluses and minuses. Right?
Oh, interesting.
Right. Yeah. Everybody gets a prize, right? which means that a 99 is going to be the same as an 89.5, which would be an A. I round up.
Wow.
Right. So when at the end of the semester, I always, at the very end of the semester, when I go through all the final GPAs, right? And when I write to the students telling them what their grade is, I always tell them what their grade is as per a plus minus, right? And the one student who got the highest grade, right? And in some cases, it could be what I call an A++ if they've got like above a 98, right? I write to them that you had the highest grade in the class. And this was really a wonderful feat, and you've done a superb thing. So there are some people who really enjoy the class and do that well. Well, no, I wouldn't say enjoy the class. There's some people who are there and do that well and have my, and don't take this word out of context, but like a guru affection, right? Madhvacharya writes about this. And there's some who enjoy the class and still are happy with their C or their D.
Interesting. Okay. And then within the tradition itself, what's the means to salvation? Is it jnana bhakti or samyucha? What is it?
Yeah, well, so it's complicated. The means of salvation is bhakti via proper jnana, right? And you have to have basic jnana, but then as I've argued and suggested that since there's a gradation, that if you have enlightened bhakti is what I called it, like a bhakti that so Madhvacharya is very controversial, right? Is that he does limit as per the old kinds of rules of adhikara.
Yeah.
That's what I wrote my dissertation on, about who has access to the texts. So he writes, for example, that women and Shudras and people who are born outside of the caste system can get the gist of the text in the vernacular from whoever wants to give it, right? But clearly their understanding of Krishna, let's say, is going to be different from somebody who can read the text and gets commentary from somebody in the lineage of Vishnu, right? And Madhvacharya, right? And so consequently, there's going to be a difference in the kind of experience that of bhakti that they have, right? So it's an enlightened bhakti. But finally, once you show this enlightened bhakti, if you're predestined, then you need to get the grace of Vishnu Prasada, the grace of Vishnu, and Vishnu gives you like chapter 11 on the Bhagavad Gita, and you get this insight and awareness, and then you've achieved it.
Which is, what's interesting to me about Madhva's deeply stratified gradation view. You also end up with a movement like the Haridasa movement, which is seems in many ways to be much more egalitarian pushing.
Or Chaitanya, right? Like the Chaitanya tradition, right? So you have and who vaguely and sometimes wants to have affiliation with Dvaita Vedanta, right?
Yeah.
And it's right, they're much more egalitarian. And Madhvas are my Madhva teachers had a peculiar, relationship. They first, for a long time, when I first met me, people thought I was a Hare Krishna, right?
Yeah.
Because I had a ponytail and earrings and so on. And, they are appreciative that Chaitanya is appreciative of Dvaita Vedanta, but it's not the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Right. And with Haridasa, I think that what Bananjay and others have said is that there are gradations to the capacity for people to give bhakti, in the same way that Advaita thinks that people who are Advaita are just not that smart and might eventually will be, in a kind of Unitarian sense, that eventually they'll be reborn if they are smart enough as an Advaitin. Just think about how this the Sarvadashna Samgraha is organized, right?
Right.
And I organized my introduction to Indian philosophy with Dvaita at the end for that reason.
Now you might change it to Nagarjuna, huh?
Well, it's funny you say that, is that the book is set up that way, but when I teach it, I always end up with Nagarjuna.
Yeah. It's interesting how people's positions change over time, in terms of what you learn and your experiences.
But I think in this case, my position returned. Like I think I began thinking more like Madhyamika, constructivism, and so on, and that I've had this long, peculiar journey, and I've had to. I was going to say something in a second about that, and I've now come back to it. It's something I was talking with somebody about, kind of my initial kind of orthodoxy and my status as a Madhva in my early career in Risa. And in a funny way, I wondered, and my friends on Risa who hear this are going to feel bad, and I don't mean to make them feel bad, but it is peculiar to think about this, is that in a funny way, that I certainly, it could be imagined that I played a particular role, and I fulfilled a particular desire for my older Risa colleagues, is that I became an insider-outsider, and I represented the community. And so I had to play that sometimes, and I had to be that. So I don't want to say quite like minstrel, right? But in a funny way, you sometimes have to, in that world of that kind of, we add kind of colonization and all those kinds of things in there, I had to be I had to represent something in a funny way. So I don't want to blame these people, but I wonder if that plays a role too in why I continued to debate and Madhva. It was kind of fun to take this orthodox position for a little while.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, the other point on this is, aside from, your shift, to back to Madhyamika, were you ever bhakti oriented, or was it more jnana oriented for you?
Well, it's funny you say that. I think that when I was in India doing my dissertation work and post-head injury and studying at the Vidyapitham, is that there's no question that I embraced kind of bhakti orientation. And but making kind of Madhva Vedanta part of a right cognitive habit is that has to happen, right?
Right.
And I combined that in interesting ways with my love at that time for Carnatic music.
Oh yeah.
So I would go and I would have epiphanies and feel bhakti and feel that the people I was listening to were like channeling all of these things. And I studied Bharatanatyam a little bit. And I thought that was a similar sort of thing. And I became a funny kind of, I don't want to say perennialist, but Eliadian perennialist, I'll say, is that there was a time that I recognized, or I believed that Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and listening to Qawwali music was also bhakti enhancing. So I would listen to Carnatic music, I would listen to Hindustani music, and I would listen to Qawwali music. And I imagined that I was, inhabiting kind of a bhakti universe at that time.
Yeah, but I think that's pretty par for the course, right? Especially the idea of Nada Brahman as music as being this form of a divinity that plays out within the subcontinent.
Right. And in those days when I was living in Jayanagar 4th T block, I hung out with musicians. I had a friend who played the flute. He was a student of Mysore Nagaraj, and I was across the street from some people who played music for Bharatanatyam, and I hung out with Guruji Bhanumati, who was a Bharatanatyam teacher who recently passed away, and I hung out in Nrityagram.
Yeah.
So and all of those, and especially kind of the improvisational aspect of Hindustani and Carnatic, kind of overlapped for me with Coltrane and jazz and all of that stuff. So it's funny is that you said that it makes sense that those all connected. And now when I talk about it and think about it, it would be you could easily classify me as just yet another hippie who's gone to India.
Yeah, but I feel like at some core aspects of a lot of what we're talking about, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, you end up with hippiness that it does get there. I mean, there is an orthodoxy layer across every tradition, and I think that those are the people that preserve the text or preserve the tradition as pristine, but they have difficulty engaging with new ideas, concepts of modernity.
Right. Yeah. They're not supposed to, right?
Yeah, right. It's just like, the yolk of an egg remains very, very, it's very difficult to blend it out. You need that egg yolk in order to have the stratas within.
Yeah, and my teachers at the Vidyapitam were just like that, and I loved them for it.
Yeah, I mean, and my interactions have been with these traditions is within the core. Again, I also find this very interesting is the sannyasi movement is the core of now almost all these traditions, but they're supposed to give up the world. Why are we still entrenched into society? We just created a parallel society in which, it's very fascinating to me. Like,
it's interesting, that finally that their denial of cultural capital gives them tremendous capital in those. I think you're absolutely right about that. But we can trace this kind of sannyasi to kind of recluse, well, not recluse, but Upanishadic time periods.
I actually trace the mattas to the Sangha. I actually don't think the mattas are ancient Upanishads kind of ashramas. I think they're much more closer to the Sangha of the Buddhist tradition.
Of the Buddhist tradition. Yeah, that makes sense. Fair enough. I see that. Right? But what I meant is that even during Upanishadic times, when people were becoming ascetics and denying things, people sat around them and listened to them.
Yeah, but they never had their own, like, for example, you would have ashramas that were in the forest, but there were married people usually, like Agastya and Lopamudra or Vishishta, whatever. But you would have the ascetics that would just wander, like Sullabha or Vyasa. He kind of had his own ashrama, but he really didn't. He was always moving around.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Then it's more like a Sangha. You're right.
Yeah. Because they're situated, their society's built around them. It's very interesting.
Definitely. Yeah. It is really interesting to enter those worlds and be part of those worlds. But but that said, two thoughts. One of them is to confirm it, is that it's really an amazing thing, or it has been, when you're in Bangalore and you're going through, or Bengaluru, and you're going through all this massive traffic, and you get to Hanumantanagar, and then you park and you walk into Vidyapitam, and it's quiet and it's peaceful, and those, and you're like, where the hell am I? On the other hand, when we're thinking about modernity and these traditions, is that there's scores now of Madhva scholars who seem to be doing things with kind of computers and Sanskrit and cognition, and that's bringing things up to speed in a different way.
Well, I mean, so this is some things I've talked to a few other acharyas about, is one of my gripes has been like, well, traditions have kind of just been ossified, like in the sense of like there was a vibrant engagement with other traditions through most of its history, and then for recently it's just been you engage with your Palomic, I mean not Palomic, your Palomic partner. So Advaitins will talk to Vishisht Advaitins or Dvaitins. There's not like active engagement with the Western world of
Right. So
Western thought or Islamic thought or whatever.
Yeah, here's a story for you. Okay, is that it must, when I was a grad student, Steve Rosen at Journal of Vaishnava Studies reached out to me and asked me to edit a volume on Dvaita Vedanta. It hadn't been done yet. I was still a grad student, right? So I reached out to Guruji Prahalad Achar, who's now, of course, a Swamiji. And I said, do you have a paper you can contribute? And he agreed. And he gave me some paper, okay? And I started editing it such that it would be publishable in a Western journal, okay? And every couple of days, he had tons of Sanskrit in it, right?
Yeah.
And every couple of days, I'd come and ask him, could he give me like the citation? Like, where was this text from? And show me the book and show me what page, okay?
Yeah.
And he would get so irritated with me. He was like, what is this nonsense you're asking me, right? And after he teased me enough, he would give me the book and show me the page. And of course, my Sanskrit wasn't so great that I could find it immediately on the page. And he would watch me squirm, right? It was really funny, right? Because he would just recite it.
Yeah.
He said to me sometimes, he said, now, who is this audience for?
Yeah.
They need page numbers? And I said, yeah, they don't have the text memorized. They don't have page numbers. And he basically was like, who cares about these people then? He was like, what? They are not scholars. Like, what relevance? Like, what? They're useless, right? And it was irrelevant that they read his stuff if they didn't have the knowledge capacity that he had of memorizing the text. And so the prerequisite for being a conversation partner, to engage in samvada, to have the text memorized. And,
interesting.
Yeah, and there are no scholars in the West, other than maybe Arvind, right? Maybe just a few, maybe, that have some of this stuff memorized.
Right.
I'm sure Goldman has most of the Mahabharata memorized, right? But no one is going to be able to quote Dvaita Vedanta like the scholars in the Vidyapitam, right? And if you don't have that kind of control over the text and knowledge, you are not a player. So I realized that in my own study, that I would never be fully accepted by this community, that I'd always be either an anomaly or like a Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of thing, because I don't have the capacity and never did have the capacity and have not sought to memorize these texts like that.
Right.
And Guruji, or Swamiji now, he laughed. He thought it was the funniest thing. And he thought that there was no scholar then, consequently, who required such citation that was his equal.
Interesting.
And they were all irrelevant. But to his credit, Guruji, after that, did teach a few students that were Western trained and were very good Sanskritists. So he did engage in some conversation with them. But finally, these folks are not publishing in Western journals. They don't care about them. They actually shouldn't care about them, given that their vocational drive has nothing to do with publish or perish. And anybody who needed a citation is proof that they're not a worthy conversation partner. They don't have adhikara.
Yeah. So this is the interesting part to me. Well, I get that position and I find it very interesting and obviously defendable in some sense. It's my contention is like, we have to at some point engage with others. I mean, unless you're just going to say we're just going to be siloed off, and we don't care.
Why do they need to engage?
I mean,
right?
I think there's questions and like, you know, when you did your stuff on bioethics, right? Like that YouTube video we sat down and talked.
With Haridas, but Pandit. Yeah, that was super. Yeah.
So there are things here that are happening in the world that are changing the way we think about reality and what we find. Like, for example, like the notion of birth control changed the way we thought about women as merely being mothers and you know, like the center of a house. Now their ability to become something else is playing a role. Right. The definition of what a woman is has shifted based on that.
Right. So how do you make this stuff relevant? Right. Maybe it's people like me and people who are doing comparative stuff. I mean, I did it. I've done it. So I wrote, it's embarrassing that I don't remember much of the book, but I wrote it in there in the intro that I was doing this for the community of people who want something in between. Consequently, I don't think I made anybody happy. You know,
but that's the thing. I think the work you do won't make anyone happy around the time you did it, but I think over time,
you're saying that I'm going to gain some value and fame posthumously.
Not posthumously, over time through your life is what I'm saying.
That is hilarious. No, I don't mind if people like my stuff after I die, as long as they say nice things. I don't really care about that either. I'm sure most of them won't. But yeah, you know, I think there was a time when I tried to make stuff relevant, and it was a lot of fun doing that. And the Madhvas in the Vidyapita enjoyed that very much too. I mean, they enjoyed when I asked them these questions. I think that that one can make these traditions relevant. Madhva Vedanta is very hard because it's so immersed in the caste and class system, right? Okay. And I think that there's a value to that, but then you are again doing something that's kind of strangely appropriation and comparative, is that you see some issue that's addressed and then you look at, see, how does the text address this, right? You know, I think one of my side gigs, in addition to doing cultural consulting work for Netflix and people like that, is that I do expert testimony sorts of things, right? Okay. So there'll be a case, usually it's bioethically centered, about some Hindu issue, and then I look at the text and make the text generate information, right? Right. About whether or not the malpractice damages are consequential or trivial. Sure. Right. And it's a valuable thing to do, I think. And if I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it not as well as I do. Right. But I am making then the text meaningful, but I'm making it, no, it already has meaning, but I'm making it useful or meaningful in a Western context, back to the issue of Hindutva and canon, who speaks for Hinduism, what are canonical texts, and so on. And if in, at least in the legal world, things are black and white, if I don't offer a Hindu response, that I don't know what's going to be generated. So for example, I worked on a case a few years ago about, it was fascinating, concerned a infant Hindu who was circumcised without parental consent, right?
Oh, wow. How'd that happen?
There was a mistake, right? Oh, the default, right? The default is circumcision, right? Sure. And so the question is were the damages, I mean, there were going to be damages, right, for malpractice, but are they trivial or are they consequential? Sure. And clearly, if they're trivial, if you think that, if you can prove that getting a circumcision is a good thing and that it should be done and it's the default, proving it consequential is much harder, right? So I did that, and they won the case and they got consequential damages. So I have to go through Hindu texts and think about Jaimini Griha Sutra and about touching the body and the cutting of the hair and these things, and like what is appropriate and shuddha and ashuddha, right? So I did definitely make the text relevant for now. Sure. Right. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
But that's the commentarial tradition in and of itself, right? The Nibandas and the various, the history of whatever Dharma Sutra or Dharma Shastra tradition is about taking that core text and then updating it from time to time with a commentary.
Yeah. And I've done that. I mean, I've got maybe Yeah, I've got 2 cases right now that I'm going to give the deposition next, maybe tomorrow or this week. No, I'm going to give a deposition in the next couple of weeks about this very issue, these kinds of issues. So these are really interesting.
No, and this where I'm thinking is like, this is where I want to see much of the Mattas move. And again, I also want to see the movement towards like some sense of inclusion of other people and other communities. And I don't know the Madhva tradition and people well enough to know how well it is, if it's inclusive, if it's not, or if there's I don't
look at the title of that second book of mine, Exclusivist Strategies in Madhva Vedanta, right?
Yeah.
So, or that was the title of my dissertation, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that it's not that inclusive. Yeah.
Which is crazy to me, because when I think the Haridasa tradition, it just, that seems super inclusive. Like the music, the songs, like you listen to the words and the lyrics, and it's all of
But just think, right? If we look at Christianity, right, and you have Amish people who are not that inclusive, right?
Right.
And then you have, I don't know.
Yeah, but that's like saying Hinduism. But what I'm saying is, like, within the Madhva tradition, is Haridasa separate? Is it like?
Yeah, but even then, right? Like, it's okay. Let there be lots of different traditions that interpret.
Oh, I agree. I'm okay with that. I'm absolutely about plurality. Let people do their thing, and if you want to be part of that community, then we'll figure out a way. If you don't, then don't.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the beauties of things in India, is that people maneuver and don't mind.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, but that doesn't necessarily work legally. Again, that's where the difficulty arises. Is again, when we go back to decoloniality, is this idea of the law, which is, people like Patrick Olivelli or even Donald Davis and Ludo Rucho write about how we think about Hindu law, as opposed to Western law, and the differences, right? Like,
no, it's cool stuff that they have been working on, right? Yeah, and it's really, I think I wrote about this. Which article was it? Oh, A Dead Hindu, the Final Sacrifice, and $1 million. Yeah,
I have that article. I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list.
That was a lot of fun. So I'm really sorry to cut you off here. I have to pick up my kids in a minute.
Oh, that's fine. I was going to close this out anyway, because I know.
Close it out then. Close it out.
Yeah. So so Dr. Sharma, do you have any last thoughts or words you want to give to our audience before we?
Yeah, sure. Right. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's a lot of fun to talk with you, and I appreciate you letting me like really be experimental and have as much of as fun as I could. I apologize that I couldn't represent Madhva Vedanta like I used to, but such is the nature of academic work, is that some gets left behind and there are new projects that come up. As I've said in the past, and certainly in my articles about education and teaching, is that if I've provoked you to think about what you believe, and whether you still believe it or not, but if I provoked you to think about that and to question it, then I've done my job. And so if this conversation that we've had has done that a little bit, then I'm grateful, and I'm grateful that you allowed that to happen. I hope that you've learned a little bit about me, everything there is to know about me, but you've been afraid to ask. Some of it you probably already guessed, I'm sure. If I've offended you out there, such is life, what to do.
Yeah.
And, take good care, be well. Thank you for your time. And if you want to do this again, I'm more than open to it.
No, absolutely. I would love to do this. I really enjoyed this conversation. I like the flow. I think like we had one thought coming into this. I actually liked what we did, because it's part of the show is about highlighting scholars that are doing good work within the Hindu world, the Buddhist world, or Indic work, Dharmic world, what do you want to call it, and their journeys, right? Because these categories of Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and whatever are not as fixed as people think in their heads, and people move around between these throughout their lives.
No, I have been lucky. Like, I am done so many different things, and now I've just got another phase that I'm entering.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Sharma. Appreciate your time. And everyone, I'll put his their information on the show notes where you can reach them, and also like their YouTube podcasts and so on. Well, thank you guys so much, and have a great day.
पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे, पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे, गायति वनमाली, गायति वनमाली,